All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the research update here presented by Dr. or not Dr. yet, soon to be, but with Courtney Meeks. She's in Dr. Leslie Holland's lab, and she's currently a PhD candidate. Today, she'll be talking about her research in shoot thinning and fungal disease management. And I'll just go through a couple slides here before passing it off to Dr. Leslie Holland to give her a little bit more of an introduction. So, like I was saying, Courtney Meeks is a PhD candidate at UW-Madison Department of Plant Pathology. She is in the Holland lab, and she's in the process of finishing up, which is awesome. So we have one more webinar for our cold climate fruit webinar series coming up on April 10th. That will be our last one. That will be presented by Megan Luke from Penn State University. And she'll be talking about achieving maximum sprayer effectiveness, mostly focused on air blast sprayers. Another webinar series here, the last webinar for the Emerging Berry Crops Winter Webinar Series. This will feature a farmer panel. So if you grow any berry crops, this might be a good opportunity to hear from other growers in the state about some decision making and general experience and whatnot. So that will be, April 2nd from noon to 1. So before we begin, just a reminder to mute yourself and use the Q&A chat to ask questions. There will be about 10 minutes at the end where we can answer those questions. The follow-up email will include responses to any unanswered questions, links to resources, including this intro slide deck and the recording as well. So yeah, thank you all for joining. And with that, I will pass it off to Dr. Leslie Holland.
Great, thank you, Josie. Well, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce a student in my lab, PhD candidate, Courtney Meeks. So Courtney joined me a little, probably less than 5 years ago, and has really taken the grape pathology world by storm in Wisconsin. And I'm extremely impressed with her work, and she's done quite a bit over the last few years. So she's going to summarize some of that work, not all of it, but a lot of her work is already being published, and you can also see in some extension articles as well. Her research has really been centered on extension, ensuring that research directly impacts all of you. So over time, fungal pathogens, specifically those affecting fruits, have become her main area of interest. Her previous research before joining us at UW, she examined peach and pecan pathogens in Georgia, and her current focus is now on the Wisconsin grape industry through spray program development and assessment of fungicide resistance. So Courtney, excited to have you present with us this afternoon, and please take it away.
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction, Leslie. And thank you so much, Josie, for organizing this. And it's really, this talk was supposed to be something I gave back in January at the Growing Wisconsin conference, but unfortunately, I had flu A, which was not as fun. I would much rather been in the Dells with all of y'all. So just thank you, Josie, for organizing this, and of course, Leslie, for that introduction. So as already mentioned, I'll be talking a little bit about my research updates. I'll primarily be focusing on my shoot thinning work, but then also if we have time at the end, I'll get to fungal disease management, but that's just two big chunks of data and information to go through. So for those who participated in the fungicide resistance trials, like if we collected samples from your vineyard, please know you'll be getting reports from Leslie and I here in the next couple months. But we do have some just good data to share specifically today about shoot thinning. Now, the reason this question came about was because of conversations with grape growers throughout my first 2 field seasons here in Wisconsin. And really, I know I'm preaching to the choir here. Cultivating grapes is a very labor-intensive process. It's a lot of hands-on work. And because of that, you want to make sure that where you're putting your labor inputs is the best for your operation. And so in conversations with growers and as well with Leslie and Amaya, really we wanted to know, okay, well, shoot thinning is something a lot of growers do, right? A lot of y'all are out there June into some parts of sometimes July just shoot thinning. we know horticulturally what's going on. So we know what's happening with the fruit, but we really wanted to understand, well, how is this affecting foliar diseases, especially when we know that these cold climate wine grapes are so resilient against disease. So Leslie and I wrote a grant. It was funded through NC SARE, so the North Central Sustainable Agricultural Research and Education graduate student grant. So let's start talking about this research. So this took place at 2 commercial vineyards, and this happened in the 2024 season and the 2025 season. I'll refer to these 2 sites as Site 1 and Site 2. Site 1 was in south central Wisconsin, and at that site we just utilized a block of Marquette vines. And then at Site 2 we utilized Itasca and Petite Pearl, and that was southeastern Wisconsin. Just for you to be aware, these vines were all trained on a high cordon system, and Marquette is actually going into its 10th year this year of production with planting, with Itasca and Petite Pearl coming into year 8. So well-established vines here. Now let's talk about the science of it, right? What were we actually doing to these vines to assess this shoot thinning on disease? So the first thing we did is at the start of every season, all vines were spur pruned to a 2-count bud. That was across the board. This was done by the vineyards. And so this was across everything. But this is where the treatments then come in, right? So the treatments are based on the labor input, okay? So the first labor input would be a high labor input where, I revealed treatment number 2. Sorry about that. So the first one is 4 shoots per foot of cordon. Basically, we wanted to eliminate as much foliar tissue as we could without basically eliminating harvest, right? And so this was kind of our high input, high intensity shoot thinning. And then through extension publications, talking with several growers here in the state, we wanted to figure out what the standard was. And so the standard's our medium input, which was 6 shoots per foot of cordon. And we wanted something kind of in the middle, and so this is where the low input came in. This is 8 shoots per foot of cordon. So for each labor input, we're leaving 2 shoots. And then, of course, as all good science does, we needed a untreated control, right? So no shoots were removed. We did have a baseline for this. I do want to go ahead and say, as well as dormant pruning, we did comb, right? Especially in 2024 when there were a lot of really bad thunderstorms. It was really important at the time of doing these treatments that we were combing, so pulling all of those shoots downwards, training them down. And this was done across everything, including the control. And now let's talk about the data. What were we actually out there collecting? So of course, I'm a pathologist in training, so foliar disease is my favorite thing to examine and to note. So for diseases, we were looking at anthracnose, black rot, downy mildew, powdery mildew, and then Phomopsis cane and leaf spot. So our five big grape foliar diseases, as well as those can also infect fruit. But we do know that when we are manipulating the canopy, we are also impacting the fruit, right? So we wanted to take that into account because the biggest thing is making sure that this research, you can try to translate it and envision it in your own vineyard. So we wanted to make sure we were looking at Brix, titratable acidity, and pH. We did collect harvest weights. We were just kind of interested. This was just to kind of capture the whole picture of how these treatments were affecting our vines. All right, now let's get into some data. So here, just for a brief reminder of what the 2024 and 2025 season were like. So here on the left, I have the start of our season when we started going out and actually looking at the vines all the way to harvest date, okay? So this is our growing degrees, so how warm. I find this a really good way to kind of just help us kind of compare seasons just beyond just average temperature. And so we can see 2024 started out a little bit warmer. I was wearing a jacket in 2025. Going out into field sites, which was unheard of for me. That was interesting. But then as we got into, early July, things kind of switched over. 2025 was a little bit warmer. But if you remember, we kind of had this like plateauing because at the end of 2025, it was actually rather chilly. 2024, as far as precipitation, we see here 2024 during that bloom window, there's a lot of rain, there was pop-up showers. I was caught in many pop-up showers being out in the field. And then we have this kind of leveling off towards the end of the season. 2025 started out really kind of nice, getting little sprinkles here or there. But then at the end of the season, we did kind of get hit with some showers, which you really don't want in August. But luckily, things were looking really good at this vineyard. All right, so disease rating. So on the outset, I'm going to let you know at all of the vineyards that I trialed at the last 2 years, I did not record powdery mildew at any of them. I barely recorded downy mildew at any of them. At this site, I only observed 6 leaves in totality of the hundreds of leaves that I record actually had downy mildew, and that was just on one day. So we're not going to really account for those because that wasn't the major pathogens that we were seeing. Now I'm going to move this square, don't worry, but just to kind of explain what you'll be looking at here, we have the dates along the x-axis here. Y is disease severity, so what score I gave on the disease. And then you'll see there's going to be 2 squares, the first square being 2024 and the second square being 2025. This vineyard, we only use the marquettes. And then you'll see we'll have 3 different shapes. We'll have circles, which denote anthracnose infections, squares and denoting black rot, and then triangles denoting phomopsis. And then within that, whatever color you see is the treatment in which that was found. Excuse me. So this is a little noisy because we do have a good amount of disease, right? So if we're looking here at 2024, we're seeing phomopsis early season. And we're seeing a lot of anthracnose happening here, but then a lot of leveling off. It just, the disease kind of things really tapered off there towards the end of the season. 2025, on the other hand, we're seeing a lot more triangles, so a lot more phomopsis. And you can't quite see them, but there are a good amount of squares in here too, denoting black rot. So what this is showing us is, 2024 was a little bit more disease heavy when it came across all different pathogens. 2025 was maybe a little more phomopsis heavy, but we're seeing activity, but we're not just seeing it in one color, right? We're seeing it across these treatments. So what's nice is we have this thing called area under the disease progress curve is what we call it in plant pathology. And we can take all these dots for anthracnose and we can get one number to represent how much disease we saw in that season. And so that's what you're seeing here. So anthracnose was really only a problem in 2024, but in 2025, we did see both black rot and phomopsis being widely recorded. So anthracnose, interesting enough, even though you see a lot more in the control, when we actually do statistics on it and look across the entire season, there was no treatment effect. There was not a treatment that performed better for minimizing anthracnose infections. For black rot, when looking across the years, there was a treatment effect, but it was only in 2025, and we saw more black rot in the high labor input. So we saw more black rot where there were less shoots. And then for phomopsis, we did see a treatment effect only in 2024 with the lower input. So the not control, but less, not the control, but more shoots actually having less disease. So I'll be kind of summarizing this at the end, but just interesting patterns here that we're seeing in our data. I'm not going to report on all fruit chemistry, but I'm happy to bring those graphs up just because there is a lot of data there. So I figured Brix would be the easiest to just report to y'all. Brix, we do see definitely there is a effective treatment, which is not shocking. We know when you have more sunlight, you're going to be able to allow for Brix to better develop. What's interesting is you have this beautiful linear progression, which is very normal for Brix. And we're seeing here that the high input, the less shoots, is consistently having better Brix or higher Brix development. In 2025, things were really weird. We start to kind of have that same trend, but then we have this kind of leveling off, which is probably due to the cold, is what we can predict. But just interesting notes here to see. Harvest, I'm just including this. I'm not really going to talk too much about it. We do see the more shoots you remove, the less fruit you get, which is what we expect. But what is really interesting with this is you see, if you look at the control up here at like 70 down to 40. So this is one thing we noticed with Marquette and some southern vineyards is a lot of them had injury. They had cordon dieback. And so we actually saw at this vineyard almost a halving of yield, which was really, really unfortunate, and it was something we'll kind of talk about at the end. But by and large, we're seeing like here a lot of similarity between the low and medium, and maybe a little bit here as well, just to kind of give you some ideas of what our weights looked like for these treatments. All right, let's switch over to site 2. For site 2, basically we have the exact same trends, right? Warmth was kind of the same. 2025 was typically a little bit warmer. Precipitation, we're seeing very high rainfall in 2024, and then 2025 kind of just those kind of bursts we got in August. Now let's look at disease data. Disease data is going to be represented the exact same way. However, if you remember, at this site, we had Itasca and Petite Pearl. So now there's going to be 4 squares here, with the 2 squares on top being Itasca in 2024 and 2025, and then Petite Pearl likewise in 2024 and 2025. So when we look at this, when we're looking at this disease data, the first thing is we're like, wow, okay, a lot more happening in 2024. That's not surprising. We had more precipitation. And then 2025, things were a little quieter. If we look across, if we look just within here, we're seeing a lot more circles, so a lot more anthracnose. Here we're seeing just a little bit of we're seeing phomopsis and anthracnose happening here. 2025, we're seeing a lot more domination of phomopsis, as well as you can see some squares here in black rock. But once again, we're not necessarily seeing one treatment that is standing out from the crowd. When we look at area under the disease progress curve, once again, we can see 2024 had more disease on average, and then as we look here, Petite Pearl consistently has more disease than Itasca. This trial, these 2 years of research with this vineyard, was my first time working with Itasca, and I was absolutely blown away at its resilience against disease. I had heard about it from growers, but it's wild to see for yourself just how well this cultivar is, again, how well it performs against disease. So what we're seeing here is the treatment effect we only really saw was in phomopsis in 2020, in 2025, and where we're seeing more so in the medium treatment. What's interesting to see here, this is something I see in any trial where at a site I have more than one cultivar, we're always seeing exactly how unique these cultivars are, how you have to understand that each one of these cultivars is like a unique kid, right? And each one has talents and has weaknesses. And with this one, we're seeing here when I actually looked across and did the math, Petite Pearl on average had 10 times more disease than Itasca. Now, we're also talking about really low levels of disease, right? But it's really interesting here to once again see where cultivar is so important for how we scout and how we should be thinking about diseases in vineyards. For Brix, we have Itasca here on the left and Petite Pearl here on the right. Once again, similar trends. I was blown away at how fast Itasca can just ramp up sugar like it's easy. But we do see here typically that the high input does perform a little bit better, maybe not so much in 2024. And then here for Petite Pearl, once again, we're seeing where the higher is also kind of outperforming maybe a little bit for Brix development, but not so much. 2024 was a really interesting year for fruit collection at this vineyard. Harvest. Once again, there is a treatment effect. We expect to see that, but just kind of to show you what our average, what our weights were looking like. This vineyard did really well in 2025. We're seeing, the control went from 30 to almost 45. So we're seeing a really nice increase in harvest there. And likewise for Petite Pearl, we're seeing, maybe a little bit more consistency here in the high, but a little bit of an increase overall with a lot more variability in the low. So I just threw a lot at you, a lot of graphs, a lot of shapes, a lot of information. And I think the best way to really break down the data and how I break down the data when I'm thinking about implications, food for thought, I always come back to the beloved plant pathology disease triangle, right? When we think about disease, we need to think about all these 3 elements: the pathogen, the host, and the environment. So let's talk about the host and the pathogen kind of at the same time. Because what's important to note here is all the diseases that I saw, phomopsis, black rot, anthracnose, these are pathogens that we know overwinter on that woody tissue, right? The primary inoculum is right there on the spur. You can typically see it with the naked eye. And so we really need to be thinking about, what spurs we're letting overwinter, right? Or sorry, which ones we're allowing to serve as that shoot that we leave in the new year. What y'all are doing right now, right? In your dormant pruning. One thing that this data doesn't show, but was a really interesting observation, when I do disease ratings, I don't just note 16% or 15% phomopsis. I make a lot of other observations and try to note trends that I see that might be interesting. One thing that I noticed, if you remember anthracnose at site 1, there was a lot of circles, right? A lot of that anthracnose we found on spurs that were less than perpendicular to the cordon. So what do I mean by that, right? If this is my cordon and it's sitting on the grapevine, it's pointed downwards, okay? It's pointed downwards, or it's just at a lower angle. What's the implication of that is you then have other spurs that are pointed upwards, right? And so as things fall down, those spurs and those shoots typically get pushed down underneath, making a microclimate of disease. So just not only do we need to be mindful of what spurs we're allowing to stay behind, but also where are they, right? So if we have our cordon, we typically want our shoots kind of coming up at an angle. We want something that's kind of going to be coming upwards, right? That's really going to help with airflow. That's really going to help maybe minimize some of these infections that I saw in some of these vineyards. Another one is the length of that spur, right? If you have a cordon and you have like a witch's finger coming off of it and then your spur, you might want to consider maybe trying to find a spur position that really has that 1-year-old wood really close to the cordon to really give you just a better position for overall growth. And then lastly here, the other thing we really need to think about is, especially when we think about marquette vines, is cordon health, right? So we saw that 50% reduction in harvest for that one site with marquette. And we know that marquette can sometimes have issues with overwintering, and really is very susceptible to phomopsis. So really thinking about, and there's some vineyards that this works, some it doesn't, having these really old cordons, right? That maybe we need to be training up new ones relatively more, not allowing these really long lifespans per se. And the best way to think about cordon health is looking at blind wood, right? So if you're having like a beautiful spurs every 10 centimeters and all of a sudden you're like blank for like 20, 30 centimeters, that's not necessarily a good sign as a pathologist. Typically, we correlate that with having a lot of woody pathogen infections, which can actually inhibit the ability for that grapevine to overwinter and can cause a lot of health issues. And then lastly, in regards to host, your cultivar matters, right? Seeing that distinct difference between Petite Pearl and Itasca. Really just knowing, okay, if my Petite Pearl, if that's something that I know, we know it's really susceptible to black rot, right? That's the one thing that we didn't see it as much in these two trials, but we typically see it a lot more. Really knowing that I really need to scout Petite Pearl for black rot, and maybe with my like La Crescent, I need to be looking more at downy mildew. So just remembering the weaknesses of these cultivars. Environment is critical, right? That's really the biggest part about plant pathology, especially in cold climate wine grapes, because we have these pathogens here and we have the host here, but how is that environment? What is going on in that environment that's really allowing for disease to become prevalent? And so the one thing I've noticed about Wisconsin, this in my 5 years that I've been here, is southern Wisconsin, the Driftless region, and Door County, they're somehow all Wisconsin, but the way that grapevines grow there can be so different. And so noting what your vine vigor is, right? When I go up to Door County to collect samples, to visit the Peninsular Ag Station, I'm always amazed at just how relatively low vigor that those vines are in comparison to things I see in maybe South Central Wisconsin. And not only that, but they typically just have a lower disease pressure. Being there right by the lake, being there by the lake, they get really nice just temperatures, and it just tends to be a little bit less of an issue when it comes to disease. Whereas in South Central Wisconsin, you can go visit two different counties and see very different vine vigor. And you can also see very different weather conditions. So kind of thinking about your own vineyard as we're gearing up for the field season, well, what is my vine vigor? Would I say it's really high? Are my vines really, are they really problematic? Do I tend to have a lot of rainfall? And let that maybe kind of guide more of your shoot thinning practices, which kind of leads me to this last thing, which is really trialing it in your own vineyard a little bit. So you could select random rows, right? You're like, all right, if you're on a flat vineyard, maybe a couple rows in a cultivar, you decide, all right, this one and this one, I'm just going to dormant prune, and I'm just going to, remove water spouts, and I'm just going to let it go and see what happens. Or maybe you're on a slope, right? Maybe your vineyard kind of just goes downward. And so maybe your higher vines have a lower vigor than your lower vines, or maybe even those kind of towards where it kind of levels off. So maybe you could focus your labor inputs there and kind of where you're having this higher growth, but then maybe up on the higher part of your vineyard, maybe you're good. And I really think these vines, we don't give them enough credit for how resilient they are against disease. And I really want to point out this other trial that Amaya did back before COVID. So when we're thinking about labor inputs, maybe putting a lot of labor into shoot thinning maybe isn't as important for your vineyard. But you're like, well, Courtney, my bricks, these darn bricks just don't want to develop. Amaya did research that she actually, her lab did a cluster leaf removal. Okay, so literally, just as the word says, when we're getting near veraison, going and finding the leaf or a couple leaves that are covering those fruit clusters and removing those and allowing better sunlight penetration. And their data indicated it actually did pretty well for red cultivars. So maybe there's some cultivars that you're like, you know what? I might try to focus my labor inputs on this cluster leaf removal. I don't know about y'all. I would much rather be popping off leaves than out there with my pruners hacking off shoots, right? Maybe that's just personal preference. Maybe it's therapeutic for you. But really just thinking about, as you're trying to think about the financial health of your operation, what are some things, maybe shoot things one of them, that you can begin to reassess how it's implemented in your vineyard to allow for just a better allocation of labor for you. So with that, I'm gonna, I think, wrap up. I'm happy to go to the fungicide slides if we have time, but we might already have some questions. So I do want to thank, of course, our two collaborating vineyards. Every time I collaborate with a vineyard, I feel like I learn more than they do, right? It's just really a joy to work with such fantastic and passionate grape growers. Of course, Leslie for letting me be in her lab. It's like the best lab. And then Amaya Atushka and Mike North, both kind of on the horticultural side, giving advice, allowing me to use their equipment. And then I also had the fantastic opportunity to mentor Maya and Preston, who are two undergraduates that we had in the lab in 2024 and 2025. And they were out there in the rain, the humidity, all the weather conditions. They really got a good field experience. They were in the trenches, and I'm really thankful for them for being so willing to just work with me and to learn about cold climate wine grapes. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions people might have.
Yeah, so folks there's a little Q&A button at the bottom of the screen with a question mark, and people can throw their questions in there. Or at this point, you can throw them in the chat too, and we'll share with Courtney.
And I'm sure if you have
Anybody?
questions about the fungicide resistance work, Courtney's happy to answer any questions about that as well.
You can show those graphs if people are more interested to kind of see what that looks like. I just know this is a lot of information to present. And if I all of a sudden like threw a curveball and started talking about like frac 11s, it been a lot in this talk. So I'm happy
Looks
to.
like there is one question that came through the Q&A.
Okay.
It says, was this really shoot thinning or the number of fruiting buds retained? When I think of shoot thinning, I think of non-fruiting shoots or secondary shoots.
Very good question. That's actually a really, I haven't really given that much thought. So I will say when we were removing shoots, we were primarily, was the question in the chat, Leslie? Or is that?
That was in the Q&A. Someone
Q&A.
just put a question in the chat too.
Okay. So when it comes to shoot thinning, I guess, yeah, so there is the thought of, okay, well, did you actually leave fruiting buds or did you not leave fruiting buds? And I would say, yeah, of course, that would definitely affect the harvest weights for sure. But regardless of what shoots I left, we know that they're all susceptible for disease. So if we think about just like my framework of just thinking about how disease is being impacted, I definitely think from the disease perspective, I think we're solid. Maybe from a horticultural perspective, maybe there were times where we maybe had some non-fruiting shoots, but I would say by and large, we were pulling in weights that were very similar to what the grower had. When I did actual comparisons, when I would share with them, like, hey, like here's my harvest weights, they were pretty on par with theirs. So I would say that shoot thinning in that regard, I don't think it was as affected. Hopefully, I answered that question in its totality. I'm happy to do a follow up if there's another one there.
All right, this one's from the chat. How might this apply to people growing table grapes?
Ooh, a table grape grower. I love it. Yes. So I would say for table grapes, I think there's definitely a little bit of opportunity to translate this. I am also table grapes are so resilient against disease. We have a small block at the West Madison Ag Station. I'm usually scouting it to see when I can start snacking on it. But there are times where I've gone over there to look for disease for my fungicide sampling, and they're just like they're chilling. They're doing great. And so I would say for table grapes, it might be something maybe you randomly, go to Blaine's Farm and Fleet, grab some flagging tape, maybe flag a couple vines that you're going to try that in and see how it works. But I would say there might be a little bit of translatability, but I don't want to necessarily tell you gung ho, go and try it just because there can be definitely some differences there. But I would say there's definitely some good indication that it could be worthwhile if you do a good, once again, dormant pruning. And actually, one thing I did not mention, I sincerely apologize about this, hopefully people are still listening, because these overwintering pathogens are on the spurs and they're in the cordons. One thing we need to always remember is that really good early season dormant spray, right? I know talking with growers, a lot of y'all use like a lime sulfate compound and really love the results that you get. So maybe, reaching out to one of your fellow grape growers, just making sure that you're being strategic early season. If we know this primary inoculum is there and we know that it's going to be a problem, really trying to emphasize that pre-bud burst spray, right? That could also be a really good, and that actually does translate over to table grapes for sure. So that could be a good area to look into. And I highly recommend reaching out to your fellow grape growers because a lot of them use like a lime sulfur compound that might be a good option for people to try.
Awesome. Thanks, Courtney. Yeah, I have been wondering the same thing. So thanks for asking that question. Last question here we have is, can you explain Phomopsis characteristics?
Ooh, okay. So Phomopsis, yes. Okay, so if you're looking at your woody tissue right now, so if you were to be going out in your vineyard, when you're thinking about looking at those spurs, you want to look for little black freckles. Okay, those are going to be the best ways to find Phomopsis infections there. Once you're in the season, once things are green and they're looking very tasty for the fungus, that is when those infections, I typically call them a starburst look. So you can hold a leaf up. Sometimes you might need a little bit of sunlight. It's a very overcast day. And it's a little black dot. That's where the actual fruit, that's where the actual spore landed. And then around it, it kind of makes this there's this yellowing starburst that happens. So those are the two ways of knowing that you have Phomopsis on your woody tissue, but then also if you have it on your foliar tissue.
Awesome. Well, that is all the questions we had. This was awesome, Courtney. Thank you so much for giving this talk and providing this update to folks, and thanks to all the participants as well. Glad you're
Yes.
able to join.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for hosting, Josie, and for putting this
Yeah,
together.
Thanks,
of
Courtney. We'll try
course.
and put more of Courtney's work in the newsletter too, so folks can continue following everything she's up to. So,
All right. Thank y'all so much, and have
All
a
right.
good rest of your Friday.
Take care. Bye.